Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well. We've been very busy trying to get ready for our program, and we wanted to talk about indictments, which is, we will talk a little bit about that. But all of a sudden, you know, the summit ended, and there was a press conference, and the press conference ended essentially when we were getting ready to start. So we want to make a comment about, you know, the summit, as well as the significance of these indictments. But overall, when I think of the summit, it's sort of going along with what I have talked about for years. A little bit of diplomacy never hurts. And I would say that this was significant diplomacy. It has to be that the neocons aren't very happy because Trump sounded pretty reasonable. And I think Trump won on this. And I don't think Putin was seen in a bad light. I think the two of them weren't out there to have fisticuffs and or a boxing match. And they were good. Which somebody said, well, they didn't accomplish anything. They didn't do this, this, and this. But, you know, just talking to people face to face, I think is so significant, and I thought it was very worthwhile. The problems are still out there, and this whole thing about the effort put in this country for the anti-Russian mood, you know, is so strong, and that's a mixed deal because it's like I say. So many things are bipartisan. Hatred toward Russia is bipartisan, and that to me is sad because you hear it constantly. And I think when you look at the indictments and all, you see a lot of this. So I was delighted to see them go through and have the press conference. And my guess is there'll probably be a lot of nitpicking, and I don't think there'll be many. I don't think CNN and MSNBC and these other stations are coming and say, you know what, Trump did better than we expected. You know, maybe this is a good sign. But anyway, I think the world didn't suffer from the summit, and hopefully it can be a beginning rather than an end.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Trump, which we've been pretty hard on him, and he's deserved it for a lot of things. But I think this is kind of Trump at his best. The one-on-one diplomacy with someone he obviously respects, a strong character. The press conference was pretty amazing. We just finished watching it, just concluded. A couple of points that I took away from it. President Putin talked about you know, the importance of the relationship. The Cold War is a thing of the past. The world has changed dramatically since then. We got to put this behind us. We got to talk about things that we can work together on: international security, regional crises, et cetera, et cetera. He also said very emphatically the Russian state has never interfered and is not going to interfere in the internal affairs of the U.S., for what it's worth. And then President Trump came on and he said we had a deeply productive dialogue. Diplomacy and engagement is more important than hostility. And here's something that he said that I thought was great. And I hope I got it more or less word for word. He said, nothing would have been easier for me politically than to refuse to engage with Putin. But this is a great, I think he may have stole this from you somewhere. He said, I'd rather take a political risk in the pursuit of peace than to risk peace for political reasons. Great quote.
It's great. It sounds like he may have originated that by himself, because I think that might say something. But, you know, I think this is fascinating on what's going on, and I think it's such a benefit that I wonder what it would be like if you get two people like that. It would be a lot easier if they both spoke the same language. It would be much smoother. And just sort it out and find out, which never could be done. This is helpful, but it doesn't come down to the point of, let's put it out on the table, the truth about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Let's have that out on the table. Who's at fault? Is it all the Russians? In this country, it's all the Russians. They invaded, Crimea and took over Crimea, and Ukraine is a mess because of what the West has done. But never will they talk about the coup and how our government was involved. Same way with the economics, you know, on the oil and the sanctions. You know, as good as Trump has been, you know, there's a lot to good diplomacy if you have good diplomatic markets working and not playing the game of a power source of, well, if you don't do it our way, we're going to put on sanctions. So, but I think at least they're talking and maybe they can move in that direction. But I sort of always thought that Trump doesn't enjoy putting these sanctions on Russia. I don't think it's part of his agenda, but I believe he is intimidated because there's a limit to what he thinks he can sustain in the beating up that he gets from the press, that he at times will say something, well, look at this, I'm tough on Russia, I'm tough on Russia. Yeah. But it'd be better to get to the bottom line and each side, point out who's at fault and then march on. But if they don't want to emphasize the past and find out who was guilty and who was responsible, I think what they've said and done, if they could just move on and do something about denuclearization. I find a little bit interesting about Trump saying some very good things about this get rid of some of these nuclear weapons. Yeah. At the same time, we've just authorized billions of dollars to expand our nuclear arsenal.
That's just business.
Yeah.
But, despite what the media is going to portray this press conference as, this was not a love fest by any stretch. It was very clear that there were some serious points of contention. I would say the most specific one was Iran. President Putin came out first, and he spoke first, and he talked about how successful the Iran deal has been, how Iran has submitted to the IAEA for the first time, and there's strong monitoring, and it's very successful. He pushed back, but he didn't go too far. Then President Trump came on, and he addressed Iran. He said the U.S. will not allow Iran to benefit from the eradication of ISIS in Syria. So he pushed back a little bit on Iran, too. That is definitely a point of contention, along with the apparently the election meddling issue as well. But the Iran thing, I think, is where there was a lot of tension, but they didn't take it too far. We'll see what happens.
Well, they're a long way from non-intervention. Yeah. It's fussing about all this, but I keep thinking this frank discussion that you can sort of dream about is whose side were we really on in Syria? Were we really helping ISIS? There's no way that could be. But, there's some evidence out there that Russia deserves the credit for, getting rid of ISIS and defeating ISIS there. Of course, that would make us look weak, and we can't brag about it, but the American people don't get much of the truth about all this and how much more complicated it is than how they present it to us.
Actually, I think it makes the neocons look weak. It makes us non-interventionists look strong because we said all along, don't get involved in this regime change operation. Now, we're just seeing in West Syria, I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures, Dr. Paul, but there are fields and fields and fields of weapons provided to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And if you look at all, made in America, made in America. So whatever the case, they got a hold of all of these things. We were right by saying, don't send those weapons over there, don't get involved. So they're the ones that look weak. We look strong because we're right.
We may apply that to maybe Ukraine because, the coup, what we did 2014.
Yeah.
I thought, well, there's a lot of chaos going on. But the people, it looks like one who wants to be more identified with the West and free markets and the Europeans, and these bad Russians, sort of lost that battle when they got rid of Yanukovych.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, well, I wonder how they're doing in Ukraine. So I looked it up. They're doing, badly. It's still a mess. So they won nothing. The people there must say, hey, is this any better than what we had with Yanukovych? So no, it's not an automatic. When the neocons win, it's not an automatic. But that might not be their goal. Their goal is to have an enemy.
Yeah.
Because that's what motivates this whole system of finances and oil and banking and militarism and military weaponry.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at how Crimea is doing now, it's objectively doing a lot better than it was under Ukraine, which is an economic basket case. If it wasn't a basket case, they wouldn't keep begging for more IMF money. But, stepping back a little bit, it's kind of interesting, and I know I can bring it up. It's easier for me to bring it up. But Senator Paul has been pretty visible over the weekend, and he took some hits, but he had some very good points about, hey, why not get together and have this summit? Why not talk? He had a piece in Politico today that I think has one of the best lines I've seen about foreign policy. And in a nutshell, this captures everything that's wrong with the way foreign policy is covered in the U.S. Here's what Senator Paul wrote. Foreign policy comes in many shades of gray, and those who treat it like a team sport do harm to our safety and to our politics. That's it, in a
and
nutshell.
summarizes what's been going on. I did want to talk a little bit because prior to the summit, the big issue for the last several days has been the indictments.
Yeah.
All those bad Russians have been indicted, and I'm sure that now that Putin's and Trump are buddies, I'm sure Putin's going to round up those 12 Russians and send them over here for us to prosecute them. But I think the whole thing is looking to me more like a farce than anything else, or a political stunt. The whole thing was, to make the Russians look bad, but obviously the fact that Mueller didn't present these indictments himself, he deferred to Rosenstein. It means that they don't really have a whole lot other than the politics. And it looks to me like what they did was they blamed the Russians, but they didn't blame the Republicans or Americans for dealing with them. And who wins on that, or think they're going to win? Oh, it's all going to be the neocons, because the Republicans win a little bit and the Democrats win a little bit, but both sides that don't like Russia, you can say, well, it was all Russia's fault. Yeah, we Americans weren't participating, but the Russians tried to tap into this. But there's a lot of confusion out there. I know you've read about this, but one thing that sort of fascinates me, because if it's true, if these experts that we've been reading are true, is the computers actually weren't hacked, which sounds so much more vicious and illegal. There were some that said they just logged in and started playing games. They were making fun of this. It got to be pretty silly what they were doing, that this was not serious business, except I would think that by now 90% of the American people have had this negative attitude. Those dirty Russians, they came over here and they were trying to interfere with our election, and that's something we as Americans would never do.
Yeah, we know that the hacking was done. The so-called hacking was done. What the result was, we don't know. We don't know how they got the information. But the point you make that I think is so interesting is about how the media, whether you're on the left or the right, they do the same thing. They both want to blame Russia. Fox News had a segment on today where they said, no, it's not Trump's fault. It wasn't Trump collusion. It was all Obama. It was all Susan Rice. They got taken advantage of by the Russians. So that's all propaganda. They still push the line that Russia's meddling in the elections, that Russia somehow hacked the elections and did something. But we know from WikiLeaks itself, the Vault 7 documents, that the CIA can spoof and make it look like a foreign intelligence service had gotten in. So who knows that that's not the case? Some rogue agents, we saw Peter Strzok last week. He told me this guy's not as crooked as it comes. There are probably a lot of people like that in an otherwise probably pretty decent CIA,
Well, they claim the timing was obviously a bit crooked, and they were trying to stop the summit. But the one thing that the indictments, even though they were intending to make the Russians look very, very badly, but I think most people concede it had no effect on the election. I mean, they didn't even do a good job if that's what they were doing. I don't happen to believe that they thought that they could do this. I think there were games that they were playing. And I know people don't want to hear it, but if they're really worried about interference in elections, we really ought to look to ourselves. Now, 80, 90, 100 times since World War II that we've been very much involved, and a lot of it is violence, and we overthrow governments. We do it constantly, and I've already alluded to the fact of Ukraine, and yet this has hints of maybe it was going on, but in comparison to what? I just don't think that there was a serious goal on there, and I sort of chuckle at this when the people analyze this and they start laughing on the way they did this. The Russians ought to be upset, because they think because they're making fun of their military, their top-notch military people. They have to be better than this. This is what the analysts were saying. They couldn't have been these guys. They're better than this. So.
Yeah, that is funny. Even in the indictment, it says they had no effect. Don't worry, it had no effect on the elections. Everything is fine. Our system is fine. So then is the GRU that sloppy, as you point out, the Russian military intelligence? But the timing, and you wrote about this in your column that just came out today, your weekly column, this is it strikes me at least as the last gasp of the deep state. This, what are we going to do? We're in a panic. It's Friday afternoon. You know, what are we going to do? We got to stop this somehow. Let's put these things out. And of course, just like trained dogs, the media jumped on it. You know, cancel the summit, cancel the summit. You can't talk to these people. Look what they did. No, without even realizing, and they should know better, that I think they're just propagandizing. An indictment is not a conviction. An indictment doesn't even have to have any proof in it, which this indictment, if you read it, has no proof, has no evidence.
Well, I sort of hope you're right about the deep state, you know, a major defeat, and you're not going to hear much from them. But deep states are always around, and there are people who want to influence governments, and they've certainly been involved, and they're going to be there. But the immediate effect of the opposition to Trump and the Russians, they may have had a significant setback, and let's hope so. But we still have a job to present the case for what should we do if we don't have, you know, the intervention in economics of, you know, protectionism and central banking and bailouts and militarism and all these things. We still have a job in getting the message out is what it should be like. And the deep state, of course, they have their goals. They like to stir up trouble, and they like money and power. I think they go along together. So whether it's pipelines or drilling for oil or whatever, and banking industry and the military-industrial complex, it is huge. And the Russians sell some weapons themselves,
yeah.
And there's some of our allies that like to sell weapons too. And it's a big business. And I keep thinking, all that effort to build stuff that doesn't really enhance the standard of living for a lot of people. Matter of fact, it's at the expense because it's debt driven. It ruins it undermines the currency. It ruins the middle class. So there's a cost, but the cost goes to this lower half or 60% in order to keep these deep state people going. So I hope this momentum continues. If this is a significant setback for the deep state, they've been exposed. I think that we need to build the momentum, but I don't know if all of a sudden the major networks tonight will say, you know, I guess that Daniel McAdams, Ron Paul, they have it right, so we better look at this again.
That's such a critical point that you made. The cost of all of this goes to the middle class and the working class. The cost of all this militarism. And what do they get? They've got to overcome that, so they're hit by propaganda. Whether you're a Fox watcher or an MSNBC, left and right, whatever, hit by propaganda, enemy propaganda. I would just say one other thing on the indictments. You know, earlier this year, several companies were indicted by Mueller for being involved in hacking. One of them, Concord Management, did the unexpected, as you point out. They fought back and said, "Okay, let's have a trial. Show us what you've got. Let's do discovery." And Mueller had a panic attack and said, you know, in several motions to delay. It's still pending. So it's one thing to make claims, it's another thing to prove them.
And I think we've heard an explanation of what they were doing, and this is something that is a little bit beyond my total understanding, but they called it clickbait farming, and it's commercial. They go out and they try to stimulate a lot of names that they can sell and sell products and this sort of thing.
We should do that.
Well, we better
pay
pay
for
attention.
the show.
But it had nothing to do. It was using news, I guess, or the campaign to gather people to certain websites. So they turn this around and say, well, it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy to take over the election. Besides, they weren't too worried at that time. They thought it was that Hillary would be a shoo-in anyway. That's where the problem came up. Something terrible happened, and it couldn't be. Maybe the people were shifting away from the conventional wisdom of the Democrats and the Republicans, which Hillary represented. You know, where Trump was despised by many Republican leaders, you know, because he was taking this independent stand. So it's interesting, but very helpful, and I like the discussion that's going on. But like I said, our job is to offer up the alternative of what we have today.
Yes, and I just, my final point really is, let's consider the worst case scenario, and it certainly is a possibility. We have not ruled it out because we don't have the evidence. Let's say Vladimir Putin called up his military intelligence and said, listen, we got to hack into the DNC, we got to get this info out, we got to make sure Hillary doesn't get elected, she's so hawkish. Let's say that they did that. What did they do? They hacked into these servers, they released these documents, even the intelligence community does not claim that these were falsified. These were actual documents. These are the things that the Hillary campaign was doing behind the scenes to work against democracy, to work against Bernie Sanders and work against him getting elected, and also the nefarious things that her campaign was doing. The information released was true information that we probably had a right to know. And compare that to when the U.S. does regime changes overseas. You talk about babies thrown from incubators. You talk about gassing his own people. You talk about Gaddafi giving Viagra to the troops. These are all lies. So there is a big difference, even if the worst case scenario is true. Don't forget, information released was true, and we do have a right to know both sides, what both sides are doing. Some of the dirty tricks of Trump too. We have a right to know all these things.
That is obviously what we should be doing. But I think if we really wanted to get to the bottom of it, I think when you hear the news that the DNC server has been found and has been revealed, it's been turned over to the Congress, and Congress has got up a little backbone and got it, and revealed what is in there. I think it would be a revelation. And even no matter where the chips may fall, but for some reason, that has just disappeared. And of course, many of us believe that it was, part of a benefit they wanted to give to Hillary. So we haven't heard, the end to this. It's going to continue. It'll probably be written about for a long time. But as long as we have Putin and Trump talking, I think there's less likely that we are going to be arming each other, against each other. And certainly that was the case in the past, when talking did occur, even back in World War II with the communists of the Soviets and China. And yet, even in 1963, talking about, with Khrushchev during the Cuban crisis, they at least talked under, very tough times. So talking is beneficial. Let's hope that continues, and there is no reason not to have a little bit of optimism that we're moving in that direction, and I find that good. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.